Okay, so now we're going to talk about Truman's Cold War. So now that World War II is over, we're going to look at how everybody kind of got along or didn't get along right after World War II. So, post war America had 15 million American soldiers, sailors, and Marines returning to civilian life and facing this problem of finding jobs and housing. So, Congress in 1944 created the GI Bill, which was able to be used to go to college, to give low interest government backed loans to buy homes and farms and start new businesses, and it was government stimulation of the post war economic expansion. It still exists today. Some of you may have parents who have used the GI Bill. As for post war Europe, Europe was pretty trashed. And Nazis had the Nuremberg trials. So 22 Nazi leaders were charged with crimes against humanity. 12 were sentenced to death, and Hitler and his two top aides had killed themselves and they were never tried for their war crimes. Then the US launched the Marshall Plan, which was this huge effort to provide massive financial aid to rebuild the European economies and prevent the spread of communism. And the United Nations was created to try to prevent future global wars. Now, unlike the previous League of Nations, this actually had a little bit of power behind it. As for post-war Japan, it was occupied until 1952 by America. At the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal, we tried Japanese officials in 3 categories of crimes. 28 were charged with high crimes. Over 5,700 were charged with minor violations such as prisoner abuse. Emperor Hirohito and the imperial family were never tried, and they were allowed to remain in power. It was basically decided that Hirohito wasn't really in charge, that it was Tojo who was in charge and kind of took the military action. They adopted a democratic form of government in Japan and were able to resume self-government, and they became a strong ally of the US and still remain so today. So Nazi leaders on the left and Japanese officials on the bottom stood trial for their war crimes before a panel of judges shown on the lower left, and the judges depicted are from the Tokyo court. In America after the war, we have a baby boom. Lots of babies born 1945 to 1960. This is known as the baby boomer generation. 50 million babies were born. Lots and lots of babies. Suburban growth during this time as well. We have a construction boom thanks to high demand for housing. Levittown was a mass-produced, low-priced family home neighborhood on Long Island in New York. You have low interest rates on mortgages, making it easier for people to buy. And cities became increasingly poor and racially divided. So we see more gentrification towards suburbs than cities at this point. The Sun Belt was from Florida to California, and you see the transfer of people moving from the Northwest and Northeast and Midwest to the South and to the West. And military spending shifted industry, people, and political power to the South and West, including Virginia, where we see the Pentagon, Hampton Roads. Those areas were huge in military spending during this time. As for post-war politics, Truman was president after FDR. We know that from the end of World War II. He established the Employment Act of 1946, where the Council of Economic Advisors was created to counsel the president and Congress on means of promoting national economic welfare. There was a lot of inflation, raising almost 25% during the first 1.5 years of post-war peace, and workers and unions wanted the wages to keep up because it was impossible to afford anything. As for civil rights, the Committee on Civil Rights was established in 1946. This strengthened the Civil Rights Division of the Justice Department and helped the efforts of Black leaders to end racial segregation in schools. In 1948, Truman ordered the end of racial discrimination throughout the federal government, including the armed forces. He basically went around the Southern Democrats who controlled key committees in Congress to form the Committee on Civil Rights, and he made a lot of people angry for it. The 22nd Amendment was ratified in 1951. It limited a president to a max of 2 full terms in office. So this is basically coming into effect because of FDR with his 4 presidencies. And everybody's like, look, this job killed him. Plain and simple. So let's limit it to 2 terms, just like George Washington had originally said in his farewell address. The Taft-Hartley Act was signed in 1947. Its goal was to check the growing power of unions. So they outlawed closed shop, which was a contract requiring workers to join a union before being hired. They allowed states to pass right-to-work laws outlawing the union shop. So basically, Virginia is a right-to-work state. Outlawing secondary boycotts. So this is the practice of several unions supporting a striking union by joining a boycott. And then giving the president the power to invoke an 80-day cooling off period before a strike endangering the national safety could be called. So Truman actually vetoed this bill, but then Congress overrode his veto. And this basically divided Republicans and Democrats for the 1950s. In the election of 1948, Truman's popularity was at a low point. Liberal Democrats supported Henry Wallace, who was a former VP. Southern Democrats' States' Rights Party, aka the Dixiecrats, supported Governor J. Strom Thurmond of South Carolina, and Republicans supported New York Governor Thomas E. Dewey, who was overly cautious and led an unexciting campaign. Truman attacked do-nothing Republican 80th Congress with some give 'em hell speeches, and he ultimately won the election. The Fair Deal was Truman's reform program, similar to FDR's New Deal. He urged Congress to enact national health care insurance, federal aiding to education, civil rights legislation, and funds for public housing and a new farm program. The conservative Congress blocked most of these reforms, and it was mostly defeated because of Truman's political conflicts with Congress and the pressing foreign policy concerns from the Cold War. As for Soviet relations, prior to 1945, the U.S. viewed the Soviet Union as a threat to capitalism, thanks to the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917. We were allies with the Soviet Union in World War II, and we were cooperating due to the United Nations to provide representation and having a 15-member Security Council, which maintained international security and authorized peacekeeping missions. So at the end of World War II, we found Soviet forces occupying most of Eastern and Central Europe and the eastern portion of Germany. There were all these little satellite states, which were nations under the control of a great power. You have a lot of communist dictators, mostly loyal to Moscow, in Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, Albania, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia. The United States had democratic political institutions and a generally free market economic system. The Soviet Union, on the other hand, had a totalitarian government with a communist or socialist economic system. Germany was divided up into East and West Germany after the war, same with Berlin, which was the capital. That's the tiny little multicolored dot you see in the middle of the red. West Germany and West Berlin became democratic, and they resumed self-government after a few years of American, British, and French occupation. East Germany and East Berlin remained under the domination of the Soviet Union, and they did not adopt democratic institutions. So Winston Churchill said an iron platform has descended across the continent of Europe, which a lot of people saw as an iron curtain. This referred to the satellite states of the Soviet Union and the Soviet Union during this time. So Truman's policy on handling the Soviet Union was containment. Do not uproot communism where it already existed. Don't keep fighting that battle, but keep it from spreading to any other nearby countries. This was largely done in Asia. Truman lost China to communism during this time period, and so that led to a fear that the rest would fall around it. In the 1920s, Chiang Kai-shek had control of China's central government with the Nationalist Party. Then, after World War II, there was a civil war in China between the Nationalists and the Communists, so Chiang Kai-shek versus Mao Zedong. In 1949, mainland China was controlled by the Communists, and then Taiwan was controlled by the nationalists. The US was afraid of the spread of communist domination in Asia, but in reality, China and the Soviet Union became enemies and rivals for territory. In June of 1948, the Soviet Union cut off all access by land to Berlin. Remember, it was in the center of East Germany. So Truman ordered U.S. planes to fly in supplies to West Berlin. This ultimately lasted for 11 months. Basically, what happened is stuff was either dropped out of the airplane or the airplane touched down very quickly as stuff was shoved out and took right back off again. Stalin didn't challenge the airlift, and in May 1949, the Soviets reopened the highways to Berlin so the Berliners could get their food and supplies. So now you have two different allied organizations, NATO, or the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which was composed of 10 European nations and the United States and Canada, and it was a military alliance defending all members from outside attack. The Warsaw Pact was essentially the Soviet reaction to NATO, which you see in the red below. NATO was in the blue. The National Security Act was signed in 1947, where now we have a Department of Defense, we have a National Security Council, and the Central Intelligence Agency. And we also have a peacetime draft instituted in 1948. We now have access to atomic weapons following World War II. So we have an arms race, Soviet Union versus the US, to develop the more superior weapons system. The Soviet Union tested its first atomic bomb in the fall of 1949. And in 1952, the hydrogen bomb was added to the U.S. arsenal. The National Security Council recommended to quadruple U.S. government defense spending, form alliances with non-communist countries, and convince the American public that arms buildup was definitely important. Then comes in the Korean War. It was a former Japanese colony divided at the 38th parallel. Soviet armies occupied Korean territory north of the line and U.S. below the line. In June of 1950, North Korea invaded South Korea. So Truman applied that containment policy, and the UN forces authorized to defend South Korea. North Korea pushed the South Korean and American forces all the way to the very tip of the peninsula. We had an amphibious assault at Incheon behind North Korean lines, and the UN forces pushed northward as far as the Chinese border. In November of 1950, Chinese troops crossed into Korea, overwhelmed the UN forces, leading to one of the worst defeats in U.S. military history. General MacArthur was in charge of UN forces in Korea. He made public statements criticizing the U.S. policy, so he got recalled for insubordination, but he basically returned home as a hero. Peace talks began in July of 51, and a stalemate existed. And essentially, an armistice was signed in 1953. More than 2.5 million people died, including 54,000 Americans. And as for political consequences, containment in Korea worked on the grand strategy of the Cold War, but Republicans characterized Truman as soft on communism. We also see a second Red Scare during this time period, where we're investigating the background of more than 3 million federal employees, jailing individuals for advocating the overthrow of the U.S., and making it unlawful to advocate or support the establishment of a totalitarian government. We have the House Committee on Un-American Activities, which was originally formed to seek out Nazis, but reactivated to find communists. They looked for any communist influence in the government, Boy Scouts, Hollywood, basically anywhere they could find it. Those who refused to testify in front of the committee were tried for contempt of Congress and blacklisted from their jobs. As for cultural impact, Arthur Miller's Death of a Salesman was seen as anti-American. Rodgers and Hammerstein's musical South Pacific was criticized as a communistic assault on racial segregation, and loyalty oaths were commonly required for writers and teachers as a condition of employment. We were also afraid of espionage. The Hiss case, so Alger Hiss was a prominent official in the State Department. He had helped Roosevelt at the Yalta Conference. He was accused of being a communist. In 1950, he was convicted of lying under oath and sent to prison. Julius and Ethel Rosenberg were also found guilty of treason and executed in 1953. They were a married couple. Joseph McCarthy was a Republican senator from Wisconsin, and he essentially was leading this whole Red Scare. It was kind of called McCarthyism, and it essentially became a witch hunt for communists. And just basically attacking anybody that they possibly could think of as a communist. During the 1950s and 60s, American schools regularly held drills to train children on what to do in case of a nuclear attack. American families were urged by the government to build bomb shelters in their own basements, and these kids were taught to duck and cover, so get underneath your desk, cover your head. Construction of nuclear weapons by the Soviets using technical secrets obtained through spying increased domestic fears of communism. So while we kind of had this baby boom going on, we also had a lot of fear going on about communism in the post-World War II world.